The rain struck her shoulders like accusations, each drop carrying the weight of whispered condemnations. She stood at the edge of the ballroom's marble terrace, her fingers gripping the stone balustrade until her knuckles turned white as winter bone. Behind her, the waltz continued its merciless dance, violin strings weeping melodies that seemed to mock her isolation. The silk of her borrowed gown clung to her skin, damp and cold, while inside the golden light painted shadows that looked too much like pointing fingers. He was watching her. She could feel his gaze like a brand against her spine, burning through fabric and flesh until it reached the hollow place where her heart should have been. When she finally turned, his eyes held the darkness of a promise she wasn't certain she wanted him to keep. Before we dive into the story, leave your comment with a rating from 1 to 10 and tell us which city you're joining us from. May this moment bring reflection and emotion to your heart. The morning fog clung to Thornfield Manor like a shroud, threading through the iron gates and settling in the hollows where shadows pooled deepest. Eleanor pressed her palm against the carriage window, watching the estate emerge from the mist like something born from a fever dream. The horse's hooves struck cobblestone in a rhythm that matched her pulse, quick, unsteady, afraid. She had come here as a governess, clutching a letter that promised sanctuary but felt more like a summons written in someone else's hand. The manor rose before her, all sharp angles and brooding stones, its windows reflecting nothing but gray sky. Ivy crawled up its walls like searching fingers, and somewhere in the distance she could hear the lonely cry of ravens settling into their roosts. The carriage shuddered to a halt, and the driver, a man whose face seemed carved from the same weathered stone as the manor itself, gestured toward the entrance without meeting her eyes. She stepped down onto gravel that crunched beneath her worn boots like broken promises. The air tasted of rain and something else, something that made her skin prickle with awareness. Her trunk followed with a heavy thud, the sound echoing off the manor's walls like a funeral bell. As she approached the massive oak doors, they swung open without her touch, revealing a hallway that stretched into darkness. Mrs. Blackwood emerged from the shadows, her gray dress rustling like autumn leaves. The woman's face was sharp as winter wind, her eyes the color of storm clouds. She looked Eleanor up and down with the kind of assessment reserved for livestock, and her lips curved into something that might have been a smile if it had held any warmth. "Miss Hartwell," she said, her voice carrying the crisp authority of someone accustomed to obedience. "You're younger than expected." Eleanor lifted her chin, though she felt exposed under the woman's scrutiny. "I assure you my qualifications are adequate." "Qualifications." Mrs. Blackwood repeated the word as if tasting something bitter. "Lord Ravenscroft will determine that himself. He's particular about those who serve in his household." The way she spoke his name made Eleanor's breath catch. There was reverence there, and fear, and something darker that she couldn't name. The housekeeper led her through corridors lined with portraits whose eyes seemed to follow their passage, past rooms shrouded in dust sheets that looked like sleeping ghosts. The manor breathed around them, settling into itself with creaks and sighs that sounded almost human. "The child is in the East Wing," Mrs. Blackwood said without turning. "Lady Sophia, 7 years old, though she's seen enough to age her beyond her years. She doesn't speak much since her mother passed." They climbed a staircase that curved like a spine, the banister worn smooth by countless hands. Eleanor's reflection flickered in the tall windows they passed, pale and insubstantial as candlelight. The East Wing felt different, warmer somehow, as if it held memories that the rest of the manor had forgotten. The nursery door stood slightly ajar, and through the gap, Eleanor glimpsed a small figure hunched over a book. Lady Sophia looked up as they entered, and Eleanor felt her heart contract. The child had her father's dark hair, but eyes like summer storms, gray and wild and full of unspoken questions. She was beautiful in the way that made adults uncomfortable, as if she saw too much and understood even more. "Sophia," Mrs. Blackwood said, her voice gentling slightly. "This is Miss Hartwell. She'll be your new governess." The girl studied Eleanor with an intensity that made her feel transparent. When Sophia finally spoke, her voice was soft as moth wings. "Will you stay?" The question carried weight beyond its simplicity. Eleanor knelt until they were eye level, noting how the child's fingers worried the edge of her book. "I'll stay as long as you need me." Something shifted in Sophia's expression. Hope, perhaps, or recognition of a kindred spirit. Mrs. Blackwood cleared her throat impatiently. Lord Ravenscroft expects to meet with you at 8 this evening. He dines late and keeps unusual hours. Until then, you're to remain in the east wing with the child. After the housekeeper departed, Eleanor found herself alone with Sophia, who had returned to her book. The silence stretched between them, comfortable as old wool. Outside, the wind picked up, rattling windows and sending tree branches scratching against the glass like skeletal fingers seeking entry. Eleanor unpacked her few belongings, each item a reminder of the life she'd left behind. The shabby boarding house, the endless rejections, the weight of being unwanted. "Papa doesn't like strangers," Sophia said suddenly, not looking up from her reading. "But he might like you. You have sad eyes like Mama did." The observation pierced Eleanor more deeply than any criticism might have. She had learned to armor herself against cruelty, but kindness, especially from a child who knew loss, undid her defenses entirely. "What happened to your Mama?" Sophia's fingers stilled on the page. "She went to sleep and didn't wake up. Papa says she's in heaven now, but I think she's in the walls. Sometimes I hear her crying." The words sent ice through Eleanor's veins. She wanted to offer comfort, to explain away what was surely a child's imagination, but something in the Manor's atmosphere made her reluctant to dismiss anything as impossible. Instead, she sat beside Sophia on the window seat, watching dusk paint the grounds in shades of purple and gold. "Would you like me to read to you?" Eleanor asked. Sophia nodded and handed her the book, a collection of fairy tales with gilt edges and illustrations that seemed to move in the flickering candlelight. Eleanor began to read, her voice soft in the gathering darkness, while somewhere in the depths of the Manor she could swear she heard footsteps that matched no earthly rhythm. As 8 o'clock approached, Mrs. Blackwood returned to escort Eleanor through corridors that seemed to shift and breathe in the lamplight. The dining-room doors were massive things, carved with scenes of hunting parties and dancing figures that appeared to writhe in the shadows. When they opened, Eleanor stepped into a space that felt more like a cathedral than a room meant for meals. Lord Ravenscroft stood with his back to her, silhouetted against windows that framed the night sky. He was tall, broad-shouldered, and moved with the fluid grace of a predator. When he turned, Eleanor's breath stopped altogether. His face was sharp planes and dangerous angles, beautiful in the way that storms were beautiful, compelling and terrifying in equal measure. His eyes were darker than midnight, and when they fixed on her, she felt as though he could see straight through to her soul. "Miss Hartwell." His voice was low, cultured, with an accent she couldn't place. "Mrs. Blackwood tells me you come with excellent references." Eleanor found her voice, though it sounded thin in the vast space. "I do my best to serve well, my lord." He moved closer, and she caught his scent, something like winter pine and smoke, with an undertone that made her pulse quicken. And what brings a young woman of apparent education to such isolated employment? The question was casual, but his eyes suggested he already knew more about her circumstances than she'd revealed in her letter. Eleanor lifted her chin, meeting his gaze despite the way it made her feel exposed. "Sometimes we must take what shelter we can find, my lord." Something flickered across his features. Surprise, perhaps, or approval. He gestured to the chair across from his own at the long table. "Seat. You must be hungry after your journey." The meal that followed was an exercise in careful conversation and loaded silences. He asked about her experience with children, her educational background, her family, questions that danced around the edges of deeper inquiries. Eleanor answered honestly but carefully, aware that every word was being weighed and measured. The food was rich and perfectly prepared, but she could barely taste it under the intensity of his attention. "Sophia has been through considerable trauma," he said at length, swirling wine in a glass that caught the candlelight like blood. "She requires someone with patience and understanding, someone who knows what it means to be displaced." The word hung between them, loaded with implication. Eleanor set down her fork, her appetite gone. "I understand loss, my lord, and I understand what it means to search for where one belongs." His eyes sharpened, and for a moment she thought he might smile. Instead, he leaned back in his chair, studying her with renewed interest. "Do you believe in ghosts, Miss Hartwell?" The question should have seemed absurd, but in this place, with shadows dancing at the edge of vision and the wind howling through gaps in the ancient stones, it felt perfectly reasonable. I believe there are things in this world that cannot be easily explained. Wise answer. He stood, moving to the window where moonlight painted his profile in silver and shadow. Thornfield holds many secrets. Some are beautiful, others less so. As long as you remain in the east wing with Sophia, you should have little cause for concern. The warning was clear, though delivered with casual elegance. Eleanor rose as well, understanding that the interview was over. Thank you for the opportunity, my lord. I won't disappoint you. He turned then, and something in his expression made her breath catch. For just a moment, the careful mask slipped, and she saw exhaustion there, and loneliness deeper than any she'd known. See that you don't, Miss Hartwell. Sophia has lost too much already. As she made her way back through the corridors, guided by a silent servant with a flickering candle, Eleanor felt the weight of his gaze following her until she turned the corner. In her small chamber adjoining Sophia's room, she prepared for bed with hands that trembled slightly. Through the thin walls, she could hear the child's steady breathing, and somewhere deeper in the manor, the sound of footsteps that seemed to pace endlessly through the night. She lay awake for hours, listening to the manor settle around her like a living thing. When sleep finally claimed her, she dreamed of dark eyes and voices calling her name from rooms she'd never seen. And somewhere in the depths of those dreams, she heard music, a waltz played on an instrument that sounded suspiciously like a human heart. The days that followed established a routine that felt both comforting and strange. Eleanor found Sophia to be a bright, eager student, hungry for knowledge and attention in equal measure. They read together in the mornings, practiced penmanship and arithmetic in the afternoons, and took walks through the estate's gardens when weather permitted. The child began to open like a flower turning toward sun, her natural curiosity emerging from behind the wall of grief she built around herself. But the nights belonged to a different world entirely. After Sophia fell asleep, Eleanor would sit by her window, watching shadows move across the grounds below. Sometimes she glimpsed a tall figure walking among the trees, moving with that same fluid grace she'd observed in Lord Ravenscroft. On those nights, she felt pulled toward the glass, her breath fogging the panes as she pressed closer, trying to make out details in the darkness. She began to notice other things, too. Doors that stood open when she was certain she'd closed them, drafts that carried the scent of roses though no flowers bloomed nearby, and most unsettling of all, the sound of a woman's voice humming lullabies that seemed to come from within the walls themselves. Sophia heard it too. Eleanor was certain, though the child never mentioned it directly. Mama used to sing that song, Sophia said one evening as they sat together in the nursery, the mysterious melody drifting through the air like smoke. She had the most beautiful voice. Eleanor felt her skin prickle with awareness. Do you miss her very much? Sophia nodded solemnly. But she's not really gone. She watches over me and Papa. Sometimes when he's very sad, I see her standing behind his chair, trying to touch his shoulder. The matter-of-fact way the child spoke of such things made Eleanor's heart ache. She gathered Sophia into her arms, breathing in the scent of her hair, innocence and soap and something indefinably sweet. Your mama loves you very much. Nothing will ever change that. It was during the third week of her residence that Eleanor's carefully ordered world began to shift. She had settled into the rhythm of life at Thornfield, finding purpose in Sophia's education and a strange peace in the manor's ancient walls. But that peace shattered like glass when she discovered the portrait. She had been searching for a book Sophia had mislaid, following the child's vague directions through corridors she'd been instructed to avoid. The library she found was vast and shadowy, filled with volumes that seemed to whisper secrets as she passed. It was there, hanging above the massive fireplace, that she saw the painting that stopped her heart. The woman in the portrait was ethereally beautiful, with golden hair that caught light like spun silk, and eyes the exact shade of Sophia's storm-gray gaze. She wore a gown of midnight blue that seemed to flow like water, and her smile held secrets that made Eleanor's chest tighten with recognition. But it wasn't the beauty that made her stumble backward. It was the face itself, for it was her own face staring back at her, painted with such precision that it seemed the woman might step from the canvas at any moment. Magnificent, isn't she? Eleanor spun, heart hammering, to find Lord Ravenscroft standing in the doorway. He moved into the room with that predatory grace, his eyes never leaving her face as he approached. In the lamplight, He looked like something carved from shadow and starlight, beautiful and dangerous in equal measure. "Who is she?" Eleanor whispered, though some part of her already knew the answer. "Lady Catherine Ravenscroft," he said softly, coming to stand beside her. "My late wife, Sophia's mother." The words hit her like physical blows. Eleanor stared up at the portrait, then at him, her mind reeling with implications she couldn't fully grasp. "The resemblance is uncanny," he finished, his voice rough with something that might have been pain. "You could be her twin, separated by nothing more than time and circumstance." Eleanor felt the walls of the room pressing in around her, the weight of destiny settling on her shoulders like a burial shroud. "Is that why you hired me? Because I look like her?" He was quiet for so long that she thought he might not answer. When he finally spoke, his voice carried the weight of confession. "When Mrs. Blackwood showed me your letter, I thought it was some cruel joke. The name was different, but the handwriting, it was as if Catherine had reached from beyond the grave to pen those words herself." Eleanor's legs felt unsteady. She gripped the back of a nearby chair, trying to anchor herself in a world that suddenly made no sense. "This is madness." "Is it?" He moved closer, and she could smell that intoxicating scent of pine and smoke. "Or is it fate finally correcting a mistake?" The suggestion in his words made her blood sing with possibility and terror. She forced herself to meet his eyes, searching for answers in their midnight depths. "What are you saying?" "I'm saying that some souls are meant to find each other, regardless of the obstacles placed in their path." His hand rose as if to touch her face, then fell back to his side. "I'm saying that perhaps Catherine sent you to us for a reason." The possibility that hung between them was too vast, too impossible to contemplate. Eleanor shook her head, backing toward the door. "I should return to Sophia. She'll be wondering where I am." He didn't try to stop her, but his voice followed her into the corridor. "You can run from this, Miss Hartwell, but you cannot escape what you are." Eleanor fled through the maze of corridors, her footsteps echoing off stone walls that seemed to pulse with hidden life. When she reached the safety of the East Wing, she found Sophia waiting in her nightgown, eyes wide with concern. "You look frightened," the child observed with that unsettling perception. "Did you see Mama?" Eleanor knelt before her, hands shaking as she smoothed the girl's dark hair. "What do you mean, sweetheart?" "She's been walking the halls tonight. I can hear her dress rustling." Sophia's eyes grew distant. "She's looking for something she lost." That night, Eleanor lay in her narrow bed, staring at the ceiling while her mind churned with questions that had no rational answers. The resemblance to Catherine Ravenscroft was impossible to deny, but what did it mean? Was she simply an unlucky woman who happened to share features with a dead woman, or was there something more at work, some cosmic joke or divine intervention that had brought her to this place? Sleep, when it finally came, brought dreams that felt more like memories. She walked through Thornfield's halls in a gown of midnight blue, her footsteps silent on familiar stones. Somewhere in the distance, she could hear a man calling her name, not Eleanor, but Catherine, and she felt herself drawn toward the sound like a moth to flame. When she woke, dawn was breaking through her windows, and she could swear she tasted roses on her lips. The following days brought a subtle shift in the household's dynamics. Lord Ravenscroft began joining her and Sophia for their afternoon walks, his presence both welcome and unsettling. He spoke little, but his eyes followed Eleanor's every movement with an intensity that made her skin burn. Sophia blossomed under her father's attention, chattering about her lessons and discoveries with the enthusiasm of a child starved for parental approval. It was during one of these walks that disaster struck in the form of Lady Ashford and her daughter Vivian, who arrived in a carriage that gleamed like a black beetle in the afternoon sun. Eleanor watched from the nursery window as the two women emerged, their elaborate gowns and imperious bearing marking them as members of the social elite that had always viewed her as beneath notice. Mrs. Blackwood appeared at Eleanor's elbow, her expression grim. "Lord Ravenscroft's cousin," she explained. "Lady Ashford has been persistent in her attentions since Lady Catherine's passing. She believes her daughter would make a suitable replacement." Eleanor's stomach clenched as she observed the reunion below. Lady Ashford was a handsome woman in her 50s, with steel-gray hair and the kind of bearing that suggested she'd never been denied anything she truly wanted. Her daughter Vivian was undeniably beautiful, with golden curls and porcelain skin that seemed to glow in the afternoon light. She moved with the confidence of someone who had never doubted her own worth, and when Lord Ravenscroft kissed her gloved hand, Eleanor felt something sharp and bitter rise in her throat. "They'll expect you to keep Sophia in the nursery during their visit," Mrs. Blackwood continued. "Lady Ashford finds children disruptive to adult conversation." Eleanor nodded, though every instinct rebelled against the enforced isolation. She helped Sophia with her lessons, all the while aware of the sounds drifting up from below: laughter, conversation, the clink of fine china. When evening came, and she wasn't summoned to present Sophia for a brief good night, she understood that her place in the household had been made clear. But it was Sophia herself who refused to accept the arrangement. The child appeared at Eleanor's chamber door just as the clock struck 9, her small face set with determination that reminded Eleanor powerfully of her father. "I want to see Papa," she declared. "Lady Vivian said I was too young to dine with adults, but Papa promised he would read to me tonight." Eleanor's heart ached for the child's disappointment, but she also felt a flicker of anger at the casual cruelty of dismissing a grieving child from her own father's attention. "Perhaps we should wait until tomorrow, when your father isn't entertaining guests." Sophia's jaw set in a line that was pure Ravenscroft stubbornness. He promised, and promises are important. Before Eleanor could stop her, the child marched toward the main staircase, her small figure radiating determination. Eleanor hurried after her, catching up just as they reached the door to the drawing room. Through the gap, she could see the gathering within: Lord Ravenscroft seated near the fire, Lady Ashford holding court from the sofa, and Vivian positioned strategically where the lamplight caught the golden highlights in her hair. "Really, Magnus," Lady Ashford was saying, her voice carrying the tone of someone accustomed to being heard, "it's past time you considered Sophia's need for a proper mother figure. A child cannot be raised by servants indefinitely." Eleanor felt Sophia stiffen beside her at the casual dismissal. The child stepped forward, and Eleanor's heart clenched as she watched the small figure interrupt the adult conversation with simple dignity. "Papa, you promised to read to me." The silence that followed was deafening. Lady Ashford's expression shifted to one of barely concealed irritation, while Vivian's smile became brittle as winter ice. But it was Lord Ravenscroft's reaction that mattered most, the way his features softened as he looked at his daughter, the guilt that flickered across his face. "Of course, little one," he said, rising from his chair. "I hadn't forgotten." "How charming," Lady Ashford said, though her tone suggested she found it anything but. "Perhaps Miss—" She paused, clearly having forgotten Eleanor's name entirely. "Hartwell," Eleanor supplied quietly, stepping into the doorway with her chin raised despite the weight of their scrutiny. Yes, Miss Hartwell could see to the child's needs tonight. Surely a bedtime story falls within a governess's duties. The dismissal was clear, and Eleanor felt the familiar sting of being reduced to nothing more than hired help. But before she could respond, Lord Ravenscroft's voice cut through the tension like a blade. "Miss Hartwell is responsible for Sophia's education, not her every need." His tone was mild, but there was steel beneath the courtesy. A father's promise should be kept by the father himself. He moved toward Sophia, and as he passed Eleanor, their eyes met for just a moment. What she saw there made her breath catch, gratitude, and something deeper that she didn't dare name. Then he was gone, his hand on his daughter's shoulder as they climbed the stairs together, leaving Eleanor to face the cold displeasure of his guests alone. Lady Ashford's smile was sharp as a serpent's tooth. "How devoted he is to the child, though I do worry about the influence of unsuitable companions." Her gaze raked over Eleanor with obvious disdain. A young woman in such proximity to a widower, it hardly seems proper. Eleanor felt heat rise in her cheeks, but she kept her voice steady. "I assure you, my conduct has been entirely appropriate." "I'm sure you believe so," Vivian said, her voice sweet as poison honey. "But surely you understand that a man of Lord Ravenscroft's position requires a wife of proper breeding and connections. Someone who can guide both him and his daughter in the ways of polite society." The implication was clear. Eleanor was nothing, no one, a temporary inconvenience to be brushed aside when more suitable arrangements could be made. She wanted to flee, to retreat to the safety of the East Wing where her value wasn't constantly questioned. Instead, she found herself thinking of Sophia's small hand in hers, of the trust in those storm-gray eyes, of the way the child had begun to heal under her care. "If you'll excuse me," Eleanor said with quiet dignity, "I should ensure Lady Sophia's room is prepared for her return." She left them to their scheming, but as she climbed the stairs, she could hear Lady Ashford's voice drifting after her like smoke. "Really, Magnus, you must see that changes are necessary. For Sophia's sake, if not your own." That night, Eleanor sat by her window long after the house had fallen silent, watching shadows dance across the grounds and wondering how long it would be before she was asked to pack her bags once more. The position at Thornfield had begun to feel like home, the first real home she'd known since childhood, but homes, she'd learned, were fragile things that could be snatched away without warning. When sleep finally claimed her, she dreamed again of walking through the Manor's halls in that midnight blue gown, but this time the corridors were empty, echoing with the sound of her own footsteps and nothing more. She woke with tears on her cheeks and the taste of loss bitter on her tongue. The siege, for that was how Eleanor came to think of it, continued for 3 more days. Lady Ashford and Vivian settled into Thornfield like a pair of elegant vultures, their presence transforming the Manor's atmosphere from brooding mystery to suffocating propriety. Meals became elaborate affairs from which Eleanor was pointedly excluded, and Sophia was trotted out for brief appearances before being dismissed back to the nursery. Eleanor watched the child grow quieter with each passing day, her natural exuberance dimming under the weight of constant correction and criticism. Vivian, in particular, seemed determined to reshape Sophia into her image of what a proper young lady should be, silent, obedient, and decorative. When Eleanor found the child crying over a book that had been deemed unsuitable for young minds, her heart broke a little more. "She says I'm too wild," Sophia whispered, tears tracking down her cheeks. "She says Papa will send me to boarding school if I don't learn to be a proper lady." Eleanor gathered the child close, fury burning bright in her chest. "You are perfect exactly as you are, sweetheart. Never let anyone tell you otherwise." But even as she offered comfort, Eleanor knew that her words carried little weight against the poison being dripped into impressionable ears. She was, after all, just the governess, easily replaced and quickly forgotten. It was on the 4th night that everything changed. Eleanor had been lying sleepless, listening to the familiar sounds of the Manor settling around her, when she heard something that made her blood freeze. Footsteps in the corridor outside her door, but not the heavy tread of servants or the quick clip of Lady Ashford's heels. These steps were soft, gliding, like silk against stone. She rose and pressed her ear to the door, hardly daring to breathe. The footsteps paused directly outside her room, and for a moment she could swear she heard the rustle of fabric and the faint scent of roses seeping through the keyhole. Then the sound moved on, drifting down the corridor toward the main staircase. Eleanor's rational mind told her to stay in her room, to pull the covers over her head and pretend she'd heard nothing. But some deeper instinct drove her to follow. She wrapped her shawl around her shoulders and eased her door open, peering into the darkened hallway. The corridor was empty, but she could still catch the ghost of that rose scent hanging in the air. Moving as quietly as she could, Eleanor made her way toward the main hall, her bare feet silent on the cold stones. As she reached the top of the grand staircase, she saw something that made her heart stop. A figure in a midnight blue gown was descending the stairs, her golden hair flowing behind her like liquid moonlight. The woman moved with ethereal grace, her feet seeming to barely touch the steps. Eleanor blinked, certain she was dreaming, but when she opened her eyes, the figure was still there. Lady Catherine. It had to be. The resemblance to the portrait was unmistakable, though there was something translucent about her form, as if she were made of mist and memory. Eleanor watched, transfixed, as the spectre reached the bottom of the stairs and turned toward the drawing room where the family often gathered. Without conscious thought, Eleanor found herself following. The grand hall was bathed in moonlight that streamed through tall windows, casting everything in silver and shadow. The ghostly figure had paused before the fireplace where Catherine's portrait hung, her translucent form raising one hand as if in greeting or farewell. "Catherine!" The voice came from the drawing room's entrance, and Eleanor's heart lurched as Lord Ravenscroft stepped into view. He was dressed only in shirt sleeves and dark trousers, his hair disheveled as if he'd been running his hands through it. His face was a mask of pain and longing as he stared at the apparition before him. "I know you're not real," he whispered, his voice broken. But I can't seem to let you go. The ghostly figure turned, and for a moment, Eleanor could swear those phantom eyes looked directly at her hiding place. Then Catherine, or whatever force had taken her form, began to fade, dissolving like morning mist until only the scent of roses remained. Lord Ravenscroft stood alone in the moonlight, his shoulders bowed with grief. Eleanor wanted to go to him, to offer comfort for a pain she recognized in her own soul, but she remained frozen in place, hardly daring to breathe. When he finally turned to leave, she caught a glimpse of his face in profile, ravaged by loss and something that looked almost like guilt. Eleanor waited until she was certain he was gone before creeping back to her room. She lay awake until dawn, her mind churning with questions that had no rational answers. Had she really seen Catherine's ghost, or was it some trick of moonlight and shadow? And if it was real, what did it mean for her own presence at Thornfield? The answer came sooner than she expected. The next morning brought news that Lady Ashford and Vivian would be extending their stay indefinitely, ostensibly to help plan improvements to the estate. Eleanor was taking breakfast with Sophia in the nursery when Mrs. Blackwood appeared with a summons that made her blood run cold. Lord Ravenscroft wishes to see you in his study immediately. Eleanor's hands trembled as she set down her teacup. Sophia looked up from her porridge with worried eyes, clearly sensing the tension in the air. Will you be long, Miss Eleanor? I hope not, sweetheart, Eleanor managed, though her voice sounded strange to her own ears. Continue with your reading until I return. The study was a masculine domain of dark wood and leather-bound books, dominated by a massive desk that seemed to dwarf even Lord Ravenscroft's imposing frame. He stood with his back to her when she entered, staring out the window at gardens where morning mist still clung to the rose bushes. You wish to see me, my lord? Eleanor kept her voice, steady despite the fear clawing at her chest. He turned slowly, and she was shocked by his appearance. His face was haggard, as if he hadn't slept in days, and there were shadows beneath his eyes that spoke of torment she couldn't begin to imagine. When he looked at her, something flickered across his features, recognition, longing, and something that might have been pain. Lady Ashford has brought certain concerns to my attention, he said at length, his voice carefully neutral, regarding your suitability for your current position. Eleanor's heart sank, though she'd been expecting this moment since the vultures arrived. I see. Do you? He moved closer, and she caught that familiar scent of pine and smoke. She suggests that a young, unmarried woman living in such close proximity to a widower creates an uncomfortable situation. The euphemism stung more than direct accusation might have. Eleanor lifted her chin, meeting his gaze despite the cost. I have conducted myself with perfect propriety, my lord. If my presence causes discomfort, perhaps the fault lies not with my behavior but with others' perceptions. Something sparked in his dark eyes, surprise, perhaps, or approval. Spoken like a woman with backbone. Catherine would have said something similar. The comparison made Eleanor's chest tighten. Am I to be dismissed, then? He was quiet for so long that she thought he might not answer. When he finally spoke, his words came out rough, as if torn from some deep place. Would it matter if you were? Have you found anything here worth fighting for? The question caught her off guard. She thought of Sophia's trust, of the peace she'd found in Thornfield's ancient halls, of the way her heart raced whenever he entered a room. Sophia needs stability. She's been through so much loss already. And what of you, Eleanor? Her name on his lips sent shivers through her. What do you need? The intensity in his voice, the way he said her name, it was too much. Eleanor took a step back, wrapping her arms around herself, as if she could hold her scattered pieces together. I need to know that my position here is secure, that I won't be cast aside when it becomes convenient. He moved closer, and she found herself backed against his desk with nowhere to retreat. His hands came up to frame her face, and she could feel the slight tremor in his fingers. You're not her, he whispered, as if trying to convince himself. But when I look at you, I see the ghost of what I lost, Eleanor finished, her voice barely audible. I know what I am to you, my lord, a living reminder of what you can never have again. Do you? His thumb traced the line of her cheekbone, and she felt herself trembling under his touch. Because I think you see only the surface of things. You think this is about resemblance, about filling a void left by the dead. Isn't it? The words came out more breathless than she intended. His answer was to lean closer, his breath warm against her ear. If that were true, would I feel this pull to someone so different from Catherine in every way that matters? She was gentle, biddable, content to let others guide her path. You're fire and steel wrapped in silk, Eleanor. You challenge everything you touch. The confession hung between them like a bridge neither dared cross. Eleanor closed her eyes, trying to resist the pull of his words, the promise in his touch. Lady Ashford is right. This is impossible. I'm nobody, nothing. You need someone who can stand beside you as an equal. Look at me, he commanded, and her eyes opened despite herself. What she saw in his gaze made her breath catch, not the hollow longing she'd expected, but something fierce and alive. You think I care about bloodlines and social connections? I've had all of that, and it brought me nothing but emptiness. I want someone real, someone who sees me as a man rather than a title. Before she could respond, the study door burst open. Lady Ashford swept in without ceremony, her face a mask of outraged propriety. Behind her came Vivian, whose blue eyes glittered with malicious satisfaction at the scene before them. Well, Lady Ashford said, her voice dripping with disdain. How illuminating! Lord Ravenscroft stepped back from Eleanor, but slowly, deliberately, as if refusing to be ashamed of what they'd witnessed. Cousin Millicent, I wasn't expecting you. Clearly. Lady Ashford's gaze raked over Eleanor with withering contempt. I came to discuss arrangements for Sophia's education, but I see we have more pressing matters to address. Really, Magnus, conducting liaisons with the help? What would dear Catherine think? The mention of his dead wife hit its mark. Eleanor watched Lord Ravenscroft's face close off, the walls she'd seen him lower snapping back into place. You presume too much, Millicent. Doy. Because from where I stand, it appears that this little nobody has quite forgotten her place. Lady Ashford turned her venom on Eleanor, who stood frozen under the assault. Did you really think a man of Lord Ravenscroft's standing would seriously consider someone of your background? Each word was calculated to wound, designed to remind Eleanor of every slight she'd ever endured, every door that had been closed in her face. She felt herself shrinking under the attack, becoming small and insignificant once more. That's enough, Lord Ravenscroft said, but his voice lacked conviction. Is it? Vivian stepped forward, her beauty sharp as a blade. Because I think Miss Hartwell needs to understand the reality of her situation. You are a governess, nothing more. Whatever foolish notions you may have entertained about your position here, let me disabuse you of them now. Eleanor found her voice at last, though it came out smaller than she intended. I have entertained no notions beyond doing my duty to Lady Sophia. Liar! The word cracked like a whip. You've set your cap for Lord Ravenscroft from the moment you arrived, haven't you? Playing on your resemblance to his poor dead wife, manipulating a grieving man's emotions for your own gain. The accusation was so close to her own fears that Eleanor couldn't find words to deny it. Had she been unconsciously using her resemblance to Catherine? Had she allowed herself to hope for something beyond her station? You will pack your things and leave by morning, Lady Ashford declared with the authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed. I will not have Sophia exposed to such influences. Eleanor's gaze flew to Lord Ravenscroft, searching his face for some sign that he would fight for her, that the moment they'd shared meant something. What she saw there broke her heart. Conflict, yes, but also resignation. He would not challenge his family for a governess, no matter what he might feel. I understand, Eleanor said quietly, her dignity the only armor she had left. I'll prepare my things. She moved toward the door on unsteady legs, each step feeling like a small death. Behind her, she could hear Lady Ashford's voice continuing its assault, but the words blurred together into meaningless noise. All she could think about was Sophia, who would wake tomorrow to find another person had abandoned her. Eleanor! Lord Ravenscroft's voice stopped her at the threshold, and she turned back with foolish hope blooming in her chest. But when she met his eyes, she saw only pain and frustration, and the knowledge that duty would always triumph over desire. Thank you for your service to my daughter, he said formally, as if they were strangers conducting business. Your dedication has been noted. The words were a dismissal as final as a grave. Eleanor nodded once, not trusting her voice, and fled before her composure could crumble entirely. Behind her, she heard Lady Ashford's satisfied murmur, "Really, Magnus, you'll thank me for this later. Some lines simply cannot be crossed." Eleanor spent the rest of the day in the nursery with Sophia, trying to find words to explain her departure that wouldn't devastate the child further. How could she say that love wasn't enough, that wanting something with all your heart meant nothing if the world decided you weren't worthy of it? "You're leaving because of the mean ladies, aren't you?" Sophia said with that unnerving perceptiveness. "They don't like you because you're pretty like Mama was." Eleanor gathered the child close, breathing in her sweet scent and memorizing the weight of her small body. "Sometimes grown-ups have to make difficult decisions, sweetheart. But I want you to remember that you are loved always. No matter who comes or goes, your papa loves you more than anything in this world." "But who will love you?" Sophia asked, and the innocent question nearly shattered Eleanor's composure. "I'll be fine," Eleanor lied. "I'm stronger than I look." That night, Eleanor packed her few belongings with mechanical precision, each item a reminder of dreams that had proven as insubstantial as morning mist. She was nearly finished when she heard footsteps in the corridor, not the ghostly tread of the night before, but the firm stride of someone very much alive. Lord Ravenscroft appeared in her doorway without knocking, his face a mask of anguish. For a long moment, they simply stared at each other across the small space of her chamber, the weight of everything unsaid hanging between them like a bridge on fire. "I can't let you go," he said finally, his voice raw with emotion. "God help me. I know it's wrong. I know it will cause scandal, but I can't watch you walk away." Eleanor's hands stilled on the dress she'd been folding. "Your family. My family has controlled my life for too long," he said, stepping into the room and closing the door behind him. "I let them choose my wife the first time, let them guide every decision in the name of duty and propriety. And where did it lead? To a marriage that was more duty than love, to a wife who died feeling like a stranger in her own home." The confession hit Eleanor like a physical blow. "You didn't love Catherine?" "I cared for her, respected her, tried to be a good husband. But I never felt for her what I feel when I look at you." He moved closer, his eyes blazing with an intensity that made her breath catch. "You make me feel alive again, Eleanor. For the first time since Catherine's death, I want something for myself." Eleanor shook her head, even as her heart soared at his words. "It doesn't matter what we want. The world won't accept us. I'll be your mistress at best, despised and gossiped about. And Sophia, she'll suffer for our choices. Then we'll leave," he said desperately. "All of us. We'll go somewhere no one knows us, start fresh. And abandon everything you've worked for? Your heritage, your position, your daughter's birthright." Eleanor touched his face gently, memorizing the sharp planes and shadowed hollows. "You would regret it eventually. And then you would resent me for what you gave up." He caught her hand, pressing it flat against his cheek. "You're wrong. The only thing I would regret is letting you disappear from my life." For a moment, Eleanor let herself imagine it, a cottage somewhere far from Thornfield, Sophia playing in a garden while she and Magnus, but no. It was a beautiful dream, but dreams had a way of curdling when exposed to reality. "I have to go," she whispered, pulling her hand free. "For both our sakes." He stared at her for a long moment, and she saw the exact instant when he accepted her decision. His shoulders sagged, and something died in his eyes. "If that's what you truly want, it's what has to be." Eleanor turned back to her packing, blinking away tears that blurred her vision. "Please don't make this harder than it already is." She heard him move toward the door, then pause. "Eleanor!" She didn't turn around, couldn't bear to see his face again. If you ever need anything." "I know," she said softly. "Thank you." He left without another word, and Eleanor sank onto her narrow bed, finally allowing the tears to fall. Tomorrow she would walk away from the first place that had ever felt like home, from the child who had become dear to her heart, from the man who had awakened feelings she thought herself incapable of. But tonight, she could grieve for what might have been. The morning dawned gray and cold, matching Eleanor's mood as she made her final preparations. Mrs. Blackwood had arranged for a carriage to take her to the village, where she could catch the coach to London. From there, well, she would find another position, another family in need of a governess. The cycle would begin again. Sophia clung to her as they stood in the entrance hall, the child's tears soaking through Eleanor's traveling dress. "Promise you'll write to me," Sophia begged. "Promise you won't forget me." "Never," Eleanor whispered fiercely. "You will always be in my heart, my darling girl. Always." Lady Ashford and Vivian watched the farewell with obvious satisfaction, though they had the grace to remain silent. Lord Ravenscroft was nowhere to be seen. A mercy, perhaps, since Eleanor wasn't certain she could have borne another goodbye. As the carriage pulled away from Thornfield, Eleanor allowed herself one last look at the manor that had sheltered her so briefly. In an upper window, she caught a glimpse of a tall figure standing motionless in the shadows. Then the carriage rounded a bend, and Thornfield disappeared behind a screen of trees. The journey to London passed in a blur of countryside and changing seasons of the heart. Eleanor stared out the window without really seeing, her mind caught in an endless loop of memory and regret. She had done the right thing, the only thing possible under the circumstances. So why did it feel like she was leaving her soul behind? London greeted her with its usual indifference, a city too large and busy to care about one more displaced governess seeking employment. Eleanor found lodgings in a respectable boarding house and began the familiar process of applying for positions, crafting letters that made her qualifications sound impressive while carefully omitting any mention of her most recent employment. The days blended together in a haze of rejection and diminishing hope. The few families who showed interest quickly cooled when they met her in person, perhaps sensing something different about her, some change that her time at Thornfield had wrought. Eleanor began to wonder if she was doomed to haunt employment agencies forever, a woman caught between worlds with no place in either. It was during her third week in London that the letter arrived. Eleanor recognized the handwriting immediately, Sophia's careful script, improved by their lessons together. With trembling hands, she broke the seal and read words that made her heart both soar and break. "Dear Miss Eleanor," the letter began. "Papa is very sad since you left. He stands in the library looking at Mama's picture and doesn't smile anymore. Lady Vivian tries to make him laugh, but he just walks away. I think he misses you. I miss you too. The new governess is mean and says I'm too wild. She won't let me read the books you gave me. Please come back. Papa needs you and so do I. I love you always, Sophia." Eleanor read the letter 3 times before setting it aside with hands that shook like autumn leaves. The child's words painted a picture that tore at her heart. Magnus retreating into grief and isolation, Sophia struggling under the rule of someone who didn't understand her spirit, both of them suffering for a choice that had seemed so necessary at the time. That night, Eleanor walked through London's gaslit streets, wrestling with doubts that refused to be silenced. Had she been wrong to leave? Had she let pride and fear drive her away from people who needed her? The rational part of her mind insisted that nothing had changed. She was still a governess, still beneath Magnus' station, still vulnerable to the cruel machinations of people like Lady Ashford. But her heart whispered a different truth, that love was rare and precious, worth fighting for regardless of the obstacles. That Sophia deserved better than a life shaped by other people's narrow definitions of propriety. That Magnus deserved a chance at happiness after so much loss. Eleanor stood on Westminster Bridge, watching the Thames flow beneath her feet like liquid shadow, and made a decision that would change everything. Tomorrow, she would return to Thornfield, not as a defeated supplicant begging for scraps, but as a woman who knew her own worth and was prepared to fight for what she believed in. The journey back to Thornfield took 2 days, and with each mile, Eleanor felt her resolve strengthen. She had spent too many years accepting other people's judgments about her worth, allowing circumstances to dictate her choices. No more. Whatever the consequences, she would not abandon Sophia to the mercies of people who saw her as nothing more than an obstacle to their ambitions. The manor appeared through the mist exactly as she remembered it, all brooding stones and ivy-covered walls. But something felt different as her hired carriage pulled up to the entrance, a heaviness in the air that spoke of grief deeper than seasonal change. Eleanor paid the driver and stood for a moment in the courtyard, gathering her courage for what was to come. Mrs. Blackwood answered the door herself, and her reaction to Eleanor's appearance was telling. The housekeeper's composure cracked for just an instant, revealing relief so profound it was almost painful to witness. "Miss Hartwell," she said, stepping aside to admit her. We weren't expecting you." I've come to see Lady Sophia, Eleanor said, surprised by the steadiness of her own voice. And Lord Ravencroft, if he'll receive me. Mrs. Blackwood's expression grew troubled. His lordship has been unwell since your departure. He rarely leaves the study, takes his meals there when he eats at all. Lady Sophia. She paused, as if searching for the right words. The child has been inconsolable. Eleanor's heart clenched, but she forced herself to remain composed. Where are Lady Ashford and her daughter? Gone, Mrs. Blackwood said with satisfaction. Left 2 days after you did. Lady Ashford declared the atmosphere unwholesome, and said they would return when his lordship came to his senses. So the vultures had retreated, confident that their work was done. Eleanor felt a spark of grim satisfaction at their failure to immediately claim the prize they'd sought. And the new governess? Dismissed yesterday after Lady Sophia had words with her. Mrs. Blackwood's lips twitched slightly. The child has developed quite a temper since your departure. I believe she told Miss Prim that she was a sour-faced harpy who wouldn't know proper education if it bit her on the nose. Despite everything, Eleanor found herself smiling. Trust Sophia to find creative ways to express her displeasure. May I see her? She's in the nursery. But Miss Hartwell. Mrs. Blackwood hesitated. She's changed. We all have. You're leaving. It affected more than just Lord Ravencroft and his daughter. Eleanor nodded, understanding the warning. She climbed the familiar stairs with her heart hammering against her ribs, preparing herself for whatever she might find. The nursery door stood slightly ajar, just as it had on her first day at Thornfield. But when she peered inside, her heart nearly broke at what she saw. Sophia sat curled in the window seat, staring out at the gardens with empty eyes. She had grown thinner in the weeks since Eleanor's departure, her face pale and drawn. The vibrant child who had welcomed learning with such enthusiasm had been replaced by a hollow-eyed waif who looked like she'd forgotten how to smile. "Hello, sweetheart," Eleanor said softly. Sophia turned, and for a moment, Eleanor thought the child might not recognize her. Then Sophia's face crumpled, and she launched herself across the room, clinging to Eleanor with desperate strength. "You came back," she sobbed against Eleanor's shoulder. "I wrote you a letter, but I didn't know if you got it, and Miss Prim said you wouldn't want to come back because I was too much trouble and—" "Shoo," Eleanor soothed, holding the child close and breathing in her familiar scent. "I got your letter, darling. And you are never too much trouble. Never." They held each other for a long time, and Eleanor felt pieces of her broken heart beginning to knit back together. This child needed her, loved her, and that was worth any amount of social disapproval. When Sophia finally pulled back, her eyes were bright with tears, but also with hope. "Are you staying this time?" she asked with heartbreaking vulnerability. "Please say you're staying." Eleanor cupped the child's face in her hands, seeing so much of Magnus in her features. "I'm staying if your father will have me. And if not—" She took a deep breath. "Then we'll find another way." Sophia's smile was like sunrise after endless night. "Papa will want you to stay. He's been so sad, Eleanor. He talks to Mama's picture, and sometimes I hear him crying." The image of Magnus alone with his grief made Eleanor's chest tighten. Whatever anger or resentment he might feel toward her return, she would face it. She owed him honesty, if nothing else, and she owed Sophia a chance at happiness. "Where is your father now?" Eleanor asked. "In his study. He's always in his study now." Sophia's expression grew worried. "Mrs. Blackwood has to bring his food there because he won't come out. Not even for dinner." Eleanor felt a chill of foreboding. She had left to protect Magnus from scandal, but it seemed her departure had wounded him more deeply than her presence ever could have. "Will you be all right here while I speak with him?" Sophia nodded eagerly. "Tell him I love him. Tell him I need both of you." Eleanor promised she would, then made her way through corridors that felt both foreign and familiar. So much had changed in the weeks of her absence, yet the manor remained exactly as she remembered it. Ancient stones holding secrets, shadows that seemed to move independently of their sources, and underneath it all, the sense of a house haunted by more than just the dead. The study door was closed, but she could see light beneath it. Eleanor raised her hand to knock, then hesitated. Once she crossed this threshold, there would be no going back. She would have to find words for feelings that defied expression, make choices that would echo through the rest of her life. She knocked before she could lose her nerve. Go away, came Magnus' voice from within, rough with disuse and despair. I said I didn't want to be disturbed. Eleanor's hand moved to the door handle. It's me, she said simply. The silence that followed stretched so long she began to wonder if he would refuse to see her. Then she heard movement, the scrape of a chair, footsteps crossing the floor. The door opened, and Eleanor's breath caught at the sight of him. Magnus looked like a man who had wrestled with demons and lost. His face was gaunt, his eyes shadowed with sleeplessness and grief. His clothes hung loose on his frame, and his hair looked as though he'd been running his hands through it repeatedly. When he saw her standing in the doorway, something flickered across his features, disbelief, hope, and then a careful blankness that cut her to the bone. Eleanor! Her name on his lips was barely a whisper. You're not real. You're another dream, another torment. I'm real, she said, stepping into the study before he could close the door. I'm here. He backed away from her as if her touch might burn, his eyes never leaving her face. Why? Why would you come back now, when I've finally accepted that you're gone? The pain in his voice nearly undid her. Eleanor closed the door behind her, sealing them both into the intimate space of his grief. Because Sophia wrote to me. Because I couldn't stop thinking about either of you. Because I was wrong to leave. He laughed, a sound empty of humor. Wrong. You were practical. Sensible. You saw the reality of our situation and acted accordingly. He moved to his desk, putting distance between them. Lady Ashford made sure I understood exactly how foolish I was being. A man of my position, entertaining romantic notions about a governess. The scandal it would cause, the damage to Sophia's future prospects. And do you believe that? Eleanor asked quietly. Do you believe that your happiness, Sophia's happiness, matters less than the opinions of people who care nothing for either of you? It doesn't matter what I believe. His hands gripped the edge of his desk until his knuckles went white. The world is what it is. I can't change it for you, Eleanor. I can't make you into something society will accept. Eleanor moved closer, her heart breaking at the defeat in his voice. I'm not asking you to change the world. I'm asking you to choose it. Choose us, despite what the world might say. And what kind of life would that be for you? He demanded, finally looking at her directly. Hidden away like a guilty secret, never acknowledged, never accepted? You deserve better than that. I deserve to choose for myself, Eleanor said firmly. And I choose you. I choose Sophia. I choose this strange, haunted house and the possibility of happiness within its walls. He stared at her as if she were speaking a foreign language. You don't understand what you're saying. The isolation, the whispers, the way people will look at you. I've been looked at with contempt my entire life, Eleanor interrupted. For being an orphan, for being poor, for having the audacity to educate myself beyond my station. The only difference is that now I'll be scorned for something beautiful instead of something tragic. Magnus closed his eyes, and she could see the war being fought behind his lids, duty against desire, convention against love. When he opened them again, they held a pain so raw it made her gasp. I can't ask you to sacrifice your future for me, he said quietly. I won't be responsible for ruining your life. My life was already ruined, Eleanor said, moving close enough to touch him. Until I came here, until I found a child who needed me and a man who saw me as more than just another piece of furniture to be moved around at will. She reached out and touched his face, feeling the sharp angle of his cheekbone, the slight roughness of stubble. He leaned into her touch like a man dying of thirst who had finally found water. I love you, she said simply, the words falling into the space between them like stones into still water. I love Sophia. I love this impossible, Gothic nightmare of a house. And if that makes me a fool, then I'll be a fool gladly. The transformation in his face was like watching the sun rise. The careful blankness cracked and fell away, revealing wonder and hope and something that might have been joy. His hands came up to cover hers, holding her palm against his cheek. Say it again, he whispered. I love you, Magnus Ravencroft, Eleanor said, her voice stronger now. I love your daughter, your honor, your stubborn nobility, and your complete inability to put your own happiness before duty. I love the way you look at me as if I'm something precious, and I love the way you make me feel like I'm worth fighting for. He pulled her against him then, his arms coming around her with desperate strength. Eleanor felt the shudders that ran through his frame, the way he held her as if she might disappear at any moment. When he spoke, his voice was muffled against her hair. "I thought I'd lost you forever. When you left, when I watched your carriage disappear, I felt like I was burying another wife." Eleanor pulled back to look at him, seeing the tears that tracked down his cheeks without shame. "You haven't lost me. You couldn't lose me if you tried. Are you certain?" His hands framed her face with infinite tenderness. "Because once we cross this line, there's no going back. I won't be able to let you go again." Eleanor smiled, feeling lighter than she had in weeks. "Then don't let go. Hold on tight and don't look back." His answer was to kiss her, and Eleanor felt the last of her doubts dissolve like morning mist. This was right. This was real. This was worth whatever storms might come. When they finally broke apart, both breathless, Magnus rested his forehead against hers. "Marry me," he said without preamble. "I know it's scandalous. I know it will cause talk, but marry me anyway. Be my wife, Sophia's mother, the mistress of Thornfield. Be mine, officially and completely." Eleanor's heart soared, even as her practical mind raised objections. "Magnus, think about what you're saying. The scandal will pass," he said firmly. "Scandals always do. But love like this is once in a lifetime, Eleanor. I won't waste it on other people's narrow minds." "Your family will disown you," she warned, though her resolve was weakening with every word. "Then we'll make our own family," he said simply. "You, me, Sophia, and whatever children we might have. We'll create our own traditions, our own rules." The picture he painted was so beautiful it made her ache. Eleanor thought of Sophia waiting in the nursery, of all the lonely children who might benefit from a mother who understood what it meant to be unwanted. She thought of the life they could build together within these walls, real and solid and theirs. "Yes," she whispered, and felt the last chains of her old life fall away. "Yes, I'll marry you." His smile was radiant enough to light the darkest corners of the manor. "When?" "Soon," Eleanor said, laughing at his eagerness. "But first, we have a little girl to tell. I think she's going to be very pleased." They found Sophia still in the nursery, though she was now pacing by the window with barely contained anxiety. When she saw them enter together, her face transformed with hope and joy. "Papa!" she cried, launching herself at Magnus with the same enthusiasm she'd shown Eleanor. "You're smiling again." Magnus caught his daughter and spun her around, his laughter filling the room with warmth Eleanor hadn't realized was missing. "I have something wonderful to tell you, little one." "Miss Eleanor." Eleanor corrected gently. "Just Eleanor now." "Eleanor," he amended, his eyes soft, "has agreed to marry me. Would you like her to be your new mama?" Sophia's answering shriek of delight probably echoed through half the manor. She hugged them both with fierce joy, chattering about wedding dresses and cakes, and whether Eleanor would let her stay up past her bedtime for the ceremony. Watching father and daughter together, seeing the happiness blooming in both their faces, Eleanor felt a peace settle over her that she'd never experienced before. This was home. This was family. This was worth any amount of scandal or social ostracism. Later, after Sophia had finally been convinced to go to bed, Eleanor and Magnus walked through the manor's gardens under stars that seemed brighter than they had any right to be. The roses were blooming despite the late season, their perfume heavy in the night air. "Do you really think we can make this work?" Eleanor asked, though she was no longer seeking reassurance, so much as savoring the possibility. "I think," Magnus said, stopping to pull her into his arms, "that we've already survived the worst of it. Everything else is just details." They were married 3 weeks later in the small chapel on the estate, with only Mrs. Blackwood, the vicar, and Sophia as witnesses. Eleanor wore a simple dress of ivory silk that Magnus had commissioned from the village seamstress, and Sophia scattered rose petals from the manor's gardens. It wasn't the grand society wedding that Magnus might have had with someone of proper breeding, but it was perfect in its intimacy and sincerity. Lady Ashford did indeed cut all ties with her cousin, proclaiming herself scandalized beyond repair. Other members of society followed suit, withdrawing invitations and turning cool shoulders when the new Lady Ravencroft appeared in public. But there were others, more than Eleanor had expected, who welcomed her warmly, drawn perhaps by her genuine nature and the obvious happiness of the family she'd helped create. The house itself seemed to approve of the changes. The mysterious sounds and apparitions that had haunted its halls gradually faded, as if whatever restless spirit had dwelt there had finally found peace. Catherine's portrait still hung in the library, but it no longer seemed to watch with reproachful eyes. Instead, Eleanor sometimes thought she detected approval in that painted gaze, as if the former mistress of Thornfield was pleased to see her family happy at last. Sophia flourished under Eleanor's care, growing into a confident young woman who never doubted her worth or her place in the world. She learned to read Latin and speak French, to paint watercolors and play the piano, but more importantly, she learned that love came in many forms and that families could be built as well as born. As for Eleanor herself, she discovered that happiness was not something that happened to other people in other places. It was here, in the arms of a man who saw her as his equal, in the laughter of a child who called her mama, in the ancient stones of a manor that had finally learned to hold joy instead of just shadows. The years brought changes as years do. More children arrived to fill Thornfield's nurseries with laughter. A son with his father's dark eyes and his mother's stubborn streak, twin daughters who inherited Sophia's love of books and mischief in equal measure. The manor's east wing became a proper family quarters, warm and bright, and filled with the sounds of daily life. But through all the changes, the love that had brought them together remained constant, a beacon that guided them through whatever storms arose, a foundation strong enough to build a lifetime upon. Eleanor never regretted her choice to return, never mourned the life she might have lived in conformity's safe harbor. Sometimes, in the evenings when the children were asleep and the house had settled into peaceful quiet, she and Magnus would walk through the gardens where they'd first acknowledged their love. The roses still bloomed with impossible profusion, as if the earth itself celebrated the happiness that dwelt within Thornfield's walls. "Do you ever wonder," Magnus asked one such evening, his arm warm around her waist, "what would have happened if you hadn't come back?" Eleanor considered the question, thinking of all the joy that might have been lost, all the love that might have withered without nurture. "I try not to," she said finally. "The past is just shadows now. This is real." He kissed her then, soft and sweet under the star-scattered sky, and Eleanor tasted the promise of all their tomorrows on his lips. They had chosen love over convention, courage over comfort, and in doing so had created something beautiful enough to last lifetimes. In the distance, Thornfield Manor stood proud against the night, its windows glowing with warm light, its stones finally free of the ghosts that had haunted them for so long. And within its walls, a family born of choice rather than chance slept peacefully, secure in the knowledge that love, once recognized and claimed, could indeed conquer all. If this story found a mirror in your soul, leave your comment and share. Sometimes, what hurts in us is what makes us most human.